Okay, so what I've talked about so far is a lot of the issues to do with being an ethnographer, being a participant observer in a situation, how you deal with the situation, how you deal with the problems of being overt or covert, and of making sure that you can stay in that situation, observe, record, and so on, and get some interesting results. But what is it you actually do? How do you record things? What is it you're looking at? What are you observing? And that's what I want to turn my attention to now and talk a bit more about that. What can you record, in a sense? What can you note down when you're in the setting? Okay, well, what do you observe? The setting itself, of course. So the place you're in, where it is, what it's like, what it consists of, who's there, how it changes over time or doesn't change over time, and so on. So the setting itself can be observed. The rooms people are in, the furniture they have, the people who are in those rooms, or you know, whatever those rooms are. You can observe and track events, things that happen to people in those rooms, things that they do, people they meet, the exchanges that happen, the things they talk about, and so on. All these kind of events you can talk about as well. And you can count, you can census take, in a sense. You can very simply note down who's where, when, and so on. One of the classic things done by anthropologists in the societies they studied was often some kind of census taking based upon family relationships. So this kin idea, who are your kin, would be a common question. Actually, for many societies, that's quite an important question. Who are your father and mother? Who are your cousins and nephews and God knows what else? You know, who are they and how they relate to you, and who has the control and power in your family, and so on. So those kind of census-taking things can be quite important. And other things like indicators of socioeconomic difference. I mean, the things that mark out who someone is, their position in society, and what they're allowed to do, and so on. I mean, down to very simple things, which I mentioned the other week, how people dress gives a lot away about who they are, what their position in society is, and what messages they're giving other people. So all those kind of things, you know, the kind of furniture people have, the kind of radio program to listen to, all sorts of issues like that that give indicators about social position. Okay, so I'll come back to a lot of those terms in a bit more detail in just a moment. But before that, let's have a quick look at the way to record information. How do you record information in ethnography? Now, the exercise I'll be doing with you later on, I'll be asking you to record it on a bit of paper. And that's actually the most common way still, is noting things down on a piece of paper. Now, of course, if you're covert, you can't do that. At least you can't do it in the setting. So if people don't know who you are, you've got to go away and do it later on. You've got to remember what's going on and then write it down as soon as you can. If you're not covert, then you can use other methods. And of course, a lot of things, I mean, all the classic anthropology then wasn't covert. The research was quite overt. Everyone knew who they were. It's quite clear. They had a different colour of skin, for example. They wore different clothes. They had, different style of life completely from the people they were studying. So of course it was obvious who they were. So they could use all these other things as well, like still cameras, audio, video, laptops. They wouldn't have used video because it didn't exist in those days, but they did use cameras of various kinds, and they took photographs and they took even moving images as well. We can use things like laptops and so on. We can track users using diaries, interaction logging and so on, all kinds of different ways in which we can take notes at the time of what's going on. If we're overt, if people know that we're a researcher observing things, we can use those techniques. But of course, if you're not, it's almost impossible to do that. You can, I guess, use covert kind of audio recording, but that's very dangerous. I wouldn't really think that's a thing to do in most research. Most researchers who are covert simply take notes, and they do it after the event, later on in the day. Okay, I said I'd come back to this list here, the settings, what you're looking at, what you're observing. So let's a bit more detail about the settings. Okay, well, the first thing was in the setting, you need to work out who to talk to, who's there, and who will know about things. So you talk to individuals and and find out. And of course, bear in mind, if the setting is a semi-public one, then you can often do ethnographic work, participant observation work, in an unobtrusive kind of way, just hanging around, just watching things going on. So, I mean, the obvious example would be public events, like a pop concert, for example. There's no reason why you can't do a participant observation study of a pop concert just by going along, just hanging around. You don't even have to go to the concert itself if you can't afford it. You can just hang around outside and see what's happening, how people go in, how they come out, what they're talking about, overhear conversations, look at their behaviour, their actions, particularly if they're dressing up as well for a concert. They're dressed as in some kind of outfits and costumes that the audiences sometimes do at such events. So you can find out a lot just by that kind of observation. So the settings can be quite important as a place for observing and kind of finding people who are part of that setting. So who's there, in a sense, is the big issue. Sometimes it's events. I mean, I suppose the pop concert is itself an event, it's not just a setting. I mean, the setting is the venue, the arena where it's happening or whatever. The event itself can be something which you can observe. So, who's there? Who's in the event? What's it focused on? Who's key to the event? Who's peripheral and so on? What is the history of that event? What's the lead up to it? And how do people get to the event? And what caused the event to happen? And what are the consequences of it? And with a pop concert, that's less of an issue, but with something like an election, that's very different. Some kind of political process like an election, there's a lot of lead up to it, and the event itself, and there's a lot of consequence afterwards. So it varies depending on the event. Are they repeated? Are these events that happen very often or a regular basis or not? So asking questions about that, how unlikely, how unusual, how regular is the event? And is it bounded in time and space? Can it happen anywhere? Is it only happening a certain period of time? And like I said, is it a regular event or not? And just how extensive is this event if it occurs? And of course, what kind of things we have here? What kind of things are events? Meetings, gatherings, celebrations, religious events, political and social and sporting events. There's enormous numbers of these things going on in our lives, and you can study just about any of them in participant observation. I put these on the list as well, I think, under events, classic questions about the setting and about the events, things you can ask about. Once you're in a place observing, what can you start to think about? And now, of course, we do think about all these things all the time. We are human, we are used to being in settings, we're used to interacting, so we think about these things. But in participant observation, you have to be overt about it. You have to kind of bring it out. Things which you might ordinarily not even think very much about, you just simply react to them. You now want to be able to write down and notice. So the key, I think, to participant observation is being open about things, being explicit about what is actually happening, rather than just implicitly accepting them. So, what is the physical space like? What's going on in the space? Who is involved in the space? Who is there doing things in whatever space happening? What are they doing in the activities? The objects, what objects are present? What things are they using? Is it a car they're driving, or is it a TV they're watching, or is it are they putting makeup on? Are they kind of cooking their food? All sorts of different things like that. Acts, what are they doing? Well, obviously, if there are things, there are normally acts involving those things. So TV, watching TV, but maybe not just watching it, maybe they're doing other things too, like talking to each other about the program, maybe just switching channels and so on. All sorts of things they can be doing. What kind of event is it? If it isn't an event, what kind of event? Is it a celebration? Is it a special event? Is it something ordinarily like sitting down for evening meal, something like that happens often? Goals, what do the people want to accomplish? That is the people in the setting. What are they trying to do by being there and doing those things? They just want a bit of relaxation to watch TV, for example. And their feelings. What is the mood of the group and what are their feelings about things? Now, in the exercise I'll be doing with you, all of these things are important. That's why I gave you the list, so you can kind of tick them off and look at them. As you go through and watch what's happening on screen, you can begin to note down these things. I talked also earlier on about census taking, keeping records of who's, what they're doing, what kind of person they are, and so on. Well, census taking can be cross-sectional or longitudinal. In fact, in many cases it's both. It's both comparing family against family, setting against setting, and how it changed over a period of time as well. So it can be both. And it's simply the number, the ages, the cultural background, the ethnicities of people, and so on and so forth. All of these things may or may not be important. It depends on the settings to some extent. So how many, say you're at the tennis club and you're watching people at the tennis club, how many people at the club, what their ages, sex, style of dress, how many in the group, when did they arrive, when did they leave, and so on, all these kind of issues. Very simple census taking of what's happening in the setting. Or it can be more kind of ethnographic, anthropological almost, details of each household. You know, and again, particularly anthropologists were very keen on this, taking a record of what people made up a household, who was the household, who was the kind of the parents, if you like, the chief people, who were their children, who were their relatives, and so on, how they relate to other households. A kind of map of the community almost that they were created from that, and that can be a useful thing to do as well. Other things you can collect, charts. I've just given one example here of a chart. I did this one for another purpose, based upon a study of people who were, I think, unemployed people, was the research. There was somebody who didn't have a job, wanted to know how to pay carpet, and she talked at length about the issues of how she would work out how to get a carpet for her home. She was a single mother, I think, and with little income. Now, you don't need to see the detail of this, but basically this is a way of representing her decision-making process. So here's another way you can do it, writing up afterwards what was going on in this setting. Another useful chart you can use here is the hierarchy, the organisational chart. This could be families, it could be managers and employees in a factory or whatever. This happens to be the university, the vice-chancellor and the deans and the different schools and the heads of departments, and if there's us down here in the departments at the bottom. And this can be a useful way of getting a kind of picture or a model of what's happening in the setting, who people are. It doesn't have to be formal. This is a formal kind of arrangement, but it can be an informal relationship of people. In some kind of gang, for example, some kind of club. The informal relations between people can be represented in a chart. Okay, so another set of issues you can look for are social differences. I mentioned this already, but here's a listing of some of the kind of things you can look for. Obvious things we do all the time, but as I said before, being a participant observer means being explicit about those things, remembering to note them down, remembering to think about them and recognise them, and then take a note of them. So things we're obviously doing all the time, like what people are wearing, their clothing, their hairstyle, type and amount of jewellery, what are their leisure time activities, what are they doing outside work, their speech and language patterns, what kind of accents they have, and how they talk to each other. Television program preferences, what they're watching on TV, what don't they watch, what computer games do they play or don't play, and things like that. Choice of car, what kind of car, what does it mean to them, where their home is, what their home is like, how they decorate the home, and what the house is like, and so on, what the garden's like. And each of those themselves we begin to realise the more you know about certain subgroups, some of these things can have really important subtypes. So if you're talking to young people, shoes might be a very important issue. What type of shoe? Not just is it a trainer or not a trainer, but what kind of trainer is it? What particular style is it? And that tells you a lot about that person, what they're trying to be, and so on. So in some cases, some of these things break down into quite detailed issues which you need to recognise. Not immediately obvious, from the outside, it's not clear what's going on, but you need to discover what does make a difference and what is important for the people in that setting of that particular subtype. So again, I mentioned genes, the colour, make and style are terribly important to those who are wearing the genes, but maybe invisible to someone from the outside. The Martian, in a sense, the alien coming into it, wouldn't notice that these genes were of a certain make and kind and wash and so on and so forth. So all those things are things to pay attention to. What I wanted to get to here, this is interpreted data analysis. Once you've got some information, you start to analyse the data, and what you're trying to get to in the end, and I think it's the point of this slide, is this thick description. You're looking for key events that drive the activities in the setting you're looking at. You're looking for patterns of behaviour, and of course your notes will help you begin to recognise these patterns, these recurring patterns that happen again and again. And you'll do that by triangulating, comparing one family against another one, setting against another one, event against another, and so on, in that way. Back to that constant comparison idea. And the idea is to pick up what is called rich or thick descriptions. I think the term thick descriptions comes from an American anthropologist called Clifford Geertz. And what his idea was that the description you provide, what you write up from your results, from your notes, your observations and so on, is a very rich, detailed kind of description of things. So back to the point I said at the very beginning, describing things, but describing it in a way that gives an idea of the fact that it's multidimensional, it's multifaceted. There are lots of things going on here in all sorts of kinds of ways. So the description is as rich and thick as it can be of all the detail that you've noticed in the setting. So not just someone came in, switched the TV on and watched the programme. That's a thin description. A thick description says how they came in. They rushed into the room, exhausted and breathless, plonked themselves down on the settee, picked up the remote and switched channels a few times looking for something whilst they were still talking to their friends who come in with them. Eventually they found a program they liked, but then they argued about it and so on. So you can see how the rich description, the thick description builds up an interesting and more detailed picture of what was going on. Not just somebody coming in watching TV, but how they did it, what they were doing, how they were interacting with others as they did it, and so on and so forth.
Would you look at the moods as well?
Sorry?
Like moods.
The modes?
The moods.
Oh, the moods. Oh, definitely, yes. Yeah. Are they angry? Are they anxious? Are they, friendly? Are they competitive? Yeah, all sorts of things like that. Yes, very important. Yeah. Okay, so the point about this is to get this kind of detailed description of what's happening. A bit more about analysis. How can you analyse what's going on? Well, typologies is a common feature of such analyses, and there are two types of typology: the emic and the etic. This is an emic one. An emic means a typology coming from within the group you're studying. So in this case, it's a study by Galombardo, a study of women's prisons. And she went into the prisons, did an ethnography inside the prison. She obviously wasn't covert. They knew that she was a researcher to a large extent. But she talked to the inmates and began to get ideas about how they classified other inmates in the prison, other prisoners. And of course the warders and so on as well. And here's a list of the prisoners' types of people that they came across in the prison. So the prisoners' terms, these were terms the prisoners themselves used about themselves, about others. They were snitchers, inmate cops and lieutenants. This was actually prisoners who were inmate cops. Squares, jive bitches, rap buddies, homies, connects. I don't know what most of these are actually. You have to read Jill Lumbargo's work to find out. But turnouts, lesbians, fams, stud broads, tricks, commissary hustlers, and so a huge lot list of things. Clearly, there was a huge typology that was operating in this prison, different ways of classifying people. And this is one thing we can often find in situations, is that people classify things and people in interesting kinds of ways. In this case, an emic account, because it's what the people themselves do, what the observed are doing. The alternative is what's called an etic account, or an etic, in this case, typology. Etic means coming from outside. In this case, it's the researcher who is trying to impose a typology on things. This was a study by Laughland of waiting behaviour, people queuing and waiting, and how they did it. And he came up with 5 types of people, which he called the sweet young thing, the nester, the investigator, the seasoned urban writer, and maverick. Now, I mean, don't worry what those things mean, but he was trying to classify the different kinds of people he found waiting. This is something which advertisers do a lot. If you've seen marketing people, advertisers, they very often try to classify, you know, families or mothers or whatever into different kinds of groups. You know, I remember one particular study I saw some time ago had this idea of different kinds of mums, and one of them was the muesli mum. That's a wonderful term. Once you say muesli mum, immediately in my mind it comes up a certain kind of mother, certain kind of class of household, and a certain kind of attitude towards, you know, feeding the family and the children and so on. The muesli mum, and there are of course, you know, other kinds of terms used that way by advertisers. Right, one other thing you need to know for the exercise, field notes. How do you take notes? Well, obviously you have to write them down, and if you can do them at the time, that's great. Of course, you can't do them right at the if you're covert, you can't do it exactly while things are happening. But if you're overt, you can write things down while they're happening. So as soon as you can, so you don't forget things. And you develop powers of observation, you develop memory for things, particularly for people's words. It's a good idea if you can note down what people say and jot things down quickly, what they've said, as soon as you can, so you can remember what they've said. And you need to practice, obviously, to do that. You need to describe behaviourally, so avoid interpreting what's going on. Try to say what was happening rather than why it was happening, except if the why is an explanation of what people thought about it. So if people tell you, I did this for so-and-so reason, that's fine, note that down. But don't try and give your interpretation of why it was happening, just try and note things down. I've said this already, descriptions should include clothing, carriage, items carried, status of items. Don't just say elegantly dressed, but say actually what it was that made them elegant about their dress. The dress was a certain kind that did this and did, you know, and they were these particular clothes, this colour, this fabric, and so on and so forth. Physical state of the environment, not just bright and warm, but what colours, what was on the walls, what furniture was, and so on. Now, you know, bearing these things in mind, all these things you can start to do when you watch the videotape. But it's very hard to do. I have to say, I'm now kind of overloading you so much. I mean, these categories I've given you on the handout, if you try and do all these things at once, it's extremely hard. And I hope you'll find the exercise quite difficult to do in any kind of thorough fashion. Last point about field notes, just jotted notes. You need to jot things down very quickly, but clearly enough for you to be able to read them later on. Key phrases, words, quotations. If you can put down quotations, that's great. But it can't be at length, obviously. And you may need to jot things down at inconspicuous moments. If you're in a real setting and you're covert, then particularly you've got to find these inconspicuous moments. Some people have referred to this as the weak bladder technique. It's the person who constantly makes excuses to go to the toilet because they've got a weak bladder. But what they're actually doing is going to the toilet to write down their notes. In fact, there was even one famous researcher who did this but didn't have enough paper. Actually started to use the toilet paper to write on as well. Now, I have to explain, this was the days when toilet paper was not the current kind of soft, it was the hard stuff. It was exactly like tracing paper. Izal, I think, was the make it had, and you could actually write on that with a biro. It would actually work. But you know, take paper with you if you can. Keep data interpretation separate, and again, this is the point I'm trying to make earlier on, that try not to give your interpretation of things, but keep that separate so you can clearly see what is coming from the setting and what is your idea. And one way to do that is to lay out the page a bit like this. So you have your notes going on here and somewhere down the side for your interpretations. So you can actually be explicit about the fact this is my view of what's going on here, not my observation of the setting. But notice also at the top, I've got, place, people present, date and time, things like that, so you know who was there, what was going on, etc. An interesting way of writing up those results. I put these on the handouts now as well. Field notes, good practice. Record what was said with quotations, write up as soon as possible, and use pseudonyms if that's appropriate. I think I've said most of that already.